There's a building at the center of almost every small American town, and in 1965, it was still very much alive. You could hear it from 3 blocks away on a weekday morning, the sound of a few hundred kids arriving, a bell ringing, a marching band practicing out on the field. It was the school. Not a school in the next county over, not a consolidated regional campus 40 minutes away by bus. The town's own school, where the same building often held every grade from 1st through 12th, where the teachers knew not just the students, but the students' parents, and frequently their grandparents too, because they'd taught them as well. That building was doing something most people in town never consciously thought about, because it was so obvious it was invisible. It was holding the entire town together. And in the years right around 1965, a decision was being made, in thousands of towns across the country, quietly, reasonably, with the best of intentions, that would pull that building out of the center of these towns, and with it, remove the single load-bearing wall that a huge number of small communities had been standing on without ever realizing it. Today I want to talk about that decision, what it was, why it was made, and why so many towns never fully recovered from it. Let's set the scene first, because 1965 is a genuinely important moment to understand, a kind of high water mark that's easy to miss. By the mid-1960s, a huge number of American small towns were, on the surface, still thriving. The post-war economy had been strong for 2 decades. The generation that had come home from the war had built families, and those families had filled the schools with the enormous baby boom generation, which meant that in 1965, small-town schools were often at their absolute fullest, packed with children, humming with activity, the clear, beating heart of community life. Main Street, which we've discussed in other videos on this channel, was in many towns still functioning, still lined with locally owned businesses. Friday night football games filled the stands. The town still felt, to the people living in it, permanent, the way things had always been and, they assumed, always would be. But underneath that surface, several long, slow forces we've discussed elsewhere were already at work. Farm consolidation reducing the number of families in the surrounding countryside, the interstate highway system beginning to redraw the map of which towns mattered, young people starting to feel the pull of the cities. In 1965, though, none of that had yet reached a tipping point in a lot of these towns. They were still full, still busy, still alive. And that's exactly why the decision we're going to talk about landed the way it did. Because it arrived at a town that still felt permanent, and quietly removed one of the main things that had been making it so. If understanding how these towns actually worked, and how they came apart, is something you appreciate, go ahead and subscribe to Back Home in America now, because we walk through exactly this kind of history every single week. So let's talk about the decision itself. And it has a genuinely bland, bureaucratic name that completely hides how consequential it was. School consolidation. For most of American history, small towns and rural areas ran their own local schools, often very small ones. In 1940, there were still well over 100,000 separate school districts in the United States. Many of these were tiny, a one-room schoolhouse serving a handful of farm families, or a single modest building serving one small town. Starting seriously in the post-war decades and accelerating dramatically through the 1950s and 1960s, a nationwide movement pushed hard to consolidate these small districts and small schools into larger, centralized ones. The numbers here are genuinely staggering. That figure of over 100,000 school districts in 1940 fell to around 35,000 by the mid-1960s, and would continue falling to under 20,000 in the decades after. Tens of thousands of local schools closed, merged, consolidated in the span of a single generation. And here's the part I really want to be fair about, because the reasoning behind consolidation was not villainous. It was, on paper, genuinely sensible. Larger schools could offer more, specialized teachers instead of one instructor covering every subject, science labs, better libraries, a wider range of courses, competitive sports programs, vocational training. Educators and policymakers argued, with real evidence, that a larger, consolidated school could give a rural child educational opportunities that a tiny local school simply could not match. The influential Conant Report of 1959 had argued explicitly that small high schools were educationally inadequate and should be consolidated for the good of the students themselves. This was reform, pushed by people who genuinely believed, often correctly, that they were improving the education of rural children. Nobody sat in a meeting and decided to hollow out small towns. They decided to give rural kids a better education, and by most educational measures, in many cases, they succeeded. But here's what that well-intentioned decision did to the towns themselves. And this is where the story turns. Because a school in a small town was never only a school. When a town lost its school to consolidation, it didn't just lose a building. It lost the single largest employer in many small communities. The teachers, the administrators, the cafeteria workers, the custodians, the bus drivers, often some of the only stable, salaried professional jobs in the entire town. It lost the Friday night football game that had brought the whole community together every week. The single most reliable shared event on the town's calendar, now relocated to a consolidated school in another town, where local residents were strangers in the stands. It lost the building that hosted community meetings, elections, plays, concerts, the physical gathering place where the town actually assembled as a town. And most importantly, over time, it lost its hold on young families. Because here's the quiet logic that played out in town after town. Once the school was gone, once children had to be bused 30, 40, 50 minutes each way to a school in another town, a young family deciding where to live had one less powerful reason to choose the small town, and one more reason to simply move closer to where the school, and increasingly the jobs, actually were. The school had been an anchor holding young families in place. Remove the anchor, and the slow drift of young families out of small towns, already beginning for other reasons, accelerated. I want to walk through the chain reaction carefully because it's the heart of this entire story, and it's a pattern that repeated in thousands of towns with almost eerie consistency. It starts with the school closing. The families with school-aged children now spend a huge part of their day oriented toward another town, the one with the consolidated school. The kids are bused there. Their friends are there. Their activities, their sports, their school events, all there. The parents start driving there for those events, and while they're there, they sometimes shop there too, at the larger stores near the larger school. The small town's own Main Street businesses, which we've discussed in other videos, begin to lose exactly the young family customers they most needed to survive into the next generation. Then the young families themselves begin to leave, moving to the town with the school, or to the growing suburbs, or to the city. The town's population ages. The elementary school-aged energy that once filled the streets is gone. And here's the cruelest part of the loop. With fewer children and fewer young families, the town becomes even less attractive to the next young family deciding where to settle, which means even fewer arrive to replace the ones who left. The grocery store loses customers and eventually closes. The pharmacy follows. The hardware store. Each closure makes the town a little less able to sustain a family, which drives a few more families out, which triggers a few more closures. This is the circuit we've talked about in other videos on this channel, the interdependent web of a small town, and school consolidation, in a huge number of cases, was the specific thread that, once pulled, started the whole thing unraveling. We're at the heart of what makes this story matter, and if it's resonating with you, a like on this video genuinely helps it reach more people who'd appreciate this kind of honest look back. I want to make this concrete with a specific example. The kind of town that existed under 1,000 different real names all across the country, because the pattern is easier to feel than to describe in the abstract. Picture a town, we'll call it Millbrook, sitting out on a 2-lane road surrounded by farmland, home to maybe 1,500 people in 1965. Millbrook has its own school, kindergarten through 12th grade, all in one solid brick building put up in the 1920s, with about 400 students. That school employs, all told, close to 40 people in a town of 1,500. Teachers, the principal, 2 secretaries, the cafeteria staff, the janitor, the bus drivers. On Friday nights in the fall, virtually the entire town turns out for the football game, because the Millbrook team is, in a very real sense, the town representing itself against the world. The school gymnasium hosts the town's basketball games, its holiday concerts, its graduation, and doubles as the polling place on election day and the meeting hall whenever the town needs to gather. Then, in the late 1960s, the county consolidates. Millbrook School is deemed too small, too limited in what it can offer, and its students are reassigned to a new, larger consolidated school built out near the county seat, 25 miles away. The old brick building in the center of Millbrook goes quiet. The 40 jobs largely vanish or move away. The Friday night games are now played in another town, where Millbrook parents sit in unfamiliar bleachers. Within a decade, the young families who might once have moved to Millbrook or stayed there have begun choosing the county seat instead, where the school now is, and where, increasingly, the shopping and the jobs are, too. By the time you drive through Millbrook 30 years later, that beautiful old brick school building is either boarded up or converted into apartments or simply gone, and the town around it has aged and thinned into a fraction of what it was. Millbrook isn't a real place. But some version of Millbrook is sitting on a county map in nearly every state in the country, and the people who grew up there remember exactly when the sound of that school going quiet started everything else going quiet too. I want to spend a moment on what was genuinely gained here, because I promise to be fair, and this channel doesn't do simple stories where one side is all right and the other all wrong. The children who went to those larger consolidated schools frequently did get a genuinely broader education. A student with a real gift for science who might have had one overworked teacher covering every subject in a tiny school could now have an actual chemistry lab and a teacher who specialized in the subject. A student interested in a trade could access vocational programs a small school could never have afforded. Athletic programs, music programs, advanced courses all became available to rural kids in ways they simply hadn't been before. For an individual student with specific talents and ambitions, consolidation frequently opened doors that would have stayed closed in the old system, and it would be dishonest to pretend those open doors weren't real and weren't valuable. This is, I think, the genuinely hard part of this story, and the part I find most worth sitting with. The decision that hollowed out so many towns was, at the level of the individual child's education, often a real improvement. The tragedy, if it is one, isn't that foolish people made an obviously bad choice. It's that a genuinely reasonable choice, made for genuinely good reasons, to improve children's education, carried a massive, largely unforeseen, and rarely discussed cost to the towns those children lived in. A cost that fell not on the decision-makers, but on the communities themselves, slowly, over the following decades, long after the meeting where the decision was made had been forgotten. I want to be honest about something else, too, because there's a part of this history that often gets left out of the nostalgic version entirely. School consolidation in some parts of the country was also tangled up with the era of desegregation and the broader upheavals of the 1950s and 60s, and the story of which schools closed, which merged, and who benefited was not always the simple, neutral tale of efficiency that the official reasoning suggested. In some regions, consolidation decisions intersected with race, with resources being distributed unequally, with some communities losing far more than others in ways that had nothing to do with education and everything to do with who held power. The full history of American school consolidation is not a simple story of well-meaning reformers versus charming small towns. It's a genuinely complicated one, and any honest account of it has to acknowledge that the costs and benefits were not distributed evenly or always fairly, and that the small white farm town losing its beloved school was only one part of a much larger and more complicated national story. So when we talk about what was lost, I don't want to flatten it into pure nostalgia for a simpler time. Because for a lot of Americans, that time wasn't simple and wasn't fair. What I want to hold on to is narrower, and I think still true, that a specific, reasonable-sounding administrative decision, repeated tens of thousands of times across the country, had enormous and largely unexamined consequences for the survival of small communities, and that those consequences deserve to be understood. Whatever else was also true about the era in which they happened. It's also worth saying that the speed of all this varied enormously from place to place, which is part of why it was so hard for anyone to see the pattern while it was happening. In one state, consolidation might have swept through in a single decade. In another, it stretched across 30 or 40 years, one small district at a time, each individual closure looking like an isolated local decision rather than part of a vast national transformation. A family in a town that lost its school in 1962, and a family in a town that lost its school in 1985, were living through the same fundamental process. But from where they stood, it just looked like their own town's particular bad luck, their own local school board's particular choice, rather than one small piece of something happening to thousands of towns at once. That's often how the largest historical shifts actually feel to the people inside them. Not like history, just like the ordinary, specific circumstances of their own individual lives. Here's the thought I keep returning to about all of this. We tend to imagine that when something as significant as a whole way of life disappears, it must have been destroyed by something dramatic, a disaster, a crash, a villain, a single terrible event you could point to. But the actual disappearance of the thriving American small town wasn't dramatic at all. In a huge number of cases, it started in a school board meeting, with a reasonable-sounding proposal backed by real educational research, presented by people genuinely trying to help children, approved by people genuinely trying to do the right thing. That's what I find genuinely haunting about this particular story. There was no villain. There was a decision, a defensible one, that quietly removed the load-bearing wall from thousands of communities. And by the time anyone could see the full consequences clearly, the school had been closed for 20 years. The young families were long gone, the main street was half empty, and there was no meeting you could go back to, no vote you could retake, that would put it all back the way it was. The town had already, quietly, become something else, one bust-away child at a time. So what actually remains today? Because the story isn't only loss, and I think that matters too. In some towns, the old consolidated arrangements have themselves come under new pressure, and there are places actively fighting to restore local schools, or to keep the ones they have, precisely because a later generation came to understand what the first one didn't fully see. That a school in a small town is doing far more than educating children. That it's holding the community itself together. And that its loss is not just an educational question, but an existential one for the town. Some communities have found real, creative ways to survive without the school at the center, reorienting around a different anchor, a local industry, a highway, a natural attraction, tourism. And in some towns, the school never left at all, having been just large enough, or just stubborn enough, or just lucky enough to survive the consolidation wave. And those towns often remain visibly more alive today than their neighbors that lost theirs, a kind of natural experiment visible right there on the map for anyone who knows to look. If your town lost its school to consolidation, or if you were one of the kids bused to a bigger school in another town, or if your town is one of the ones that managed to keep its own school through all of it, I would genuinely love to hear about it in the comments. These specific, local stories are exactly the kind of history that never makes it into any official account. And every one shared here adds something real to the record of what actually happened to small-town America. If this kind of honest look at the real forces that reshaped American life is something you'd like more of, go ahead and subscribe to Back Home in America. There's a lot more of this country's everyday history still waiting to be walked through, one town and one decision at a time. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.